was just chatting with Sadia here over the way the day has been unfolding, and I wonder if you've actually seen what has happened between the first panel and the second, right? In the first panel, people started talking about the challenges of globalization, and they raised the issue that one of the things you have to deal with when you face this issue of globalization is the issue of diversity. And lo and behold, what followed was then a panel on diversity. And when you came to the issues of diversity, the panel had a series of different conversations, diverse conversations on diversity, as is indeed should be the case, right? And made the point that if you are to leverage the advantages that are going to come out or potentially implicit in diversity, what you need in an organization is leadership. And so we have my colleague Jean-François Manzoni, who is going to come and talk about lifelong learning at the top, hurdles and hacks. Please welcome Jean-François.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you to applaud early, because this way it's out of the way, we're done. And as we say in French we have a say, we say, ce qui est pris n'est plus à prendre, which means once you've applauded once, you know, at least I got that one. So pleasure to be here for the graveyard shift. No, I mean for the post-lunch session. Somebody has to do it. And there's always a dilemma with this, because on one hand you say, wow, they're tired, they will be half asleep. On the other hand, there's also an argument to be made that your natural defenses are weaker at this particular point in time. And so maybe whatever manages to reach your brain will actually stay there more easily. Anyway, let's see where that takes us. One of the issues that we discussed this morning is the fact that the world of work is becoming more and more challenging. The world is becoming more global, and also the boundaries of industries are shifting, and also we see more and more new entrants, often from outside of the usual boundaries of our industries, that don't respect the rules. In the old days, you know, they would come in, they would be either cheaper or better. Now, very often, they're much better and much cheaper at the same time. We call this Big Bang disruption. At a minimum, what used to be competitive advantages that we were able to maintain for years have become much more transient advantage. And one of the comments from the floor this morning was the fact that there's a lot more rotation at the top. And indeed, that's what we observe. 60-some years ago, if you were in the S&P 500, you would stay there for 60 years. 35 years ago, you would be there for 25 years, and now you're going to be there probably around 15 years. So there's a lot more rotation at the top. It's harder for organizations. It's also harder for leaders. So you recognize this man. In 1999, he came with a mandate from Renault to try to help turn around a Japanese icon that had run in trouble. And you remember that this was, of course, an extraordinarily successful turnaround. It was also, especially early on, a pretty painful one. A number of people lost their jobs, they closed factories, so it was a tough process. And recently, Gon was asked in an article, would you do this again? And he said, oh yeah, sure. I mean, I could and I would, except if I had to do it again, I would have to be a lot more self-assured than I was. Now, those of you who know Carlos Ghosn or have seen him on video, it will not strike you that he is short on self-confidence, then or now. And I'm not saying this as a negative. I think this is a very self-assured man, and thank God he was. So I think it is all the more interesting that 15 years later he says, oh yeah, and you know, I was sure of myself 15 years ago, but if I had to do this now, it would be even harder. Now, by the way, it would be harder because I would need to be more self-assured. It would also be harder because at the same time, I would also have to be more sensitive, empathic, listening to people, understand their emotions. By the way, not just in Japan, but everywhere. And let's be frank, most of us are not programmed to do this, right? Typically, we are either good at being quite assertive and forceful or at being empathic, but rarely at the same time. So the world of work is becoming more challenging for leaders. And this morning, there were also a number of elements that you mentioned that leaders increasingly need to do. So we said we need to encourage more diversity in organizations. We need to encourage, Shifun mentioned, more individualized work practices. Well, more individualized work practices is going to mean more subjectivity in the way we allow people to do things. That's not easy. We also mentioned less inner-focused organization. Well, that's hard. We said, let's reduce the emphasis on seniority. Again, you want to do this. This is going to require you to be able to sit down in front of people and say, well, usually you would get the job, but now somebody 7 years younger than you will. So there's all sorts of things that we discussed this morning that are making the work of leaders more difficult. And so as a result, this is not a very surprising statement, senior executives need to continue to learn. In fact, let me make an even bolder statement. The speed at which you continue to learn is probably your major asset as a leader. So, of course, we need you to have been able to do things. If you've systematically failed at reaching any objective, it's going to be difficult for you to say, I've screwed everything up, but I'm the best learner of the bunch. Clearly, we need you to have achieved a certain number of things. But among the folks who have achieved a lot, we're going to pick the one who can keep learning, because we know that the job we're giving you today is going to require you to operate under very different conditions over the next few years. And of course, executives come to our programs as a part of this effort. And then they leave the program saying, wow, this was extraordinary. My mind has been stretched in ways that I couldn't imagine. It will never get back to where it was. This was life transforming. Life will never be the same again. And then you meet them a few weeks later, a few months later, and something happened, and wow, life is pretty much the same again. And so, you hear a lot from executives, yeah, sure. I mean, I learned a lot in the program, but, in terms of changing behaviors, wow, that's really hard. And, as I think about it, maybe it's it's my DNA. I was born this way. So let me ask you a question, and I'm going to give you a minute to try to convince your neighbor of your point of view on this. So we call this a buzz group. It's a way for you to avoid falling asleep up front. Just turn to your neighbor and let's have a discussion. Are leaders born or are they made? 1.5 minutes, this is supposed to be noisy. Very good. The clock. Very good, the clock. Very good to put the clock. I was wondering, how am I going to time? Very good. I'll give you another 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Okay, folks, let's get a vote. So I'm going to need you to raise your hand. You're going to vote either born or made. There is no, gee, I'm not sure in between. It kind of depends. So who would say leaders are mainly born? Mainly born. So on the born side. Mainly made. Oh, wow. Okay, very interesting. So a lot more on the made side. In other words, there is still hope for you, I guess. I think that's the main point. Huh? Okay, well, you will be happy to know that after millennia of looking at this issue, we have now a very definite answer on this question, and the answer is yes. Okay, so more specifically, let's look at two luminaries in the field of leadership. This man, I was about to say is, but was Warren Bennis. He died 3 years ago. He was one of the elder statements of the study of leadership. And here is what he said after 50 years of study. He said, look, the truth is that major capabilities and competencies can be learned. In fact, if we look, nurture is far more important than nature in determining who becomes a successful leader. So that's a very strong statement. This other fellow is Dan Goleman. He's the Pope of emotional intelligence. And same statement. Basically, we have seen evidence that point emphatically to these conclusions. Old leaders can learn new tricks. They can, and they do, make significant, in some cases, life-altering changes in their styles. So that's good news. Now, the question, of course, is, well, is that true for everyone? And the answer is, well, yes, but first, you've got to believe that this is correct. So there is a line of work that has been developing over the last 15 years. The main protagonist of that line of work is Carol Dweck. She's a psychologist at Stanford. And the general name of that line of work is the growth mindset. Basically, if you ask people, do you think that your major characteristics are the way they are, it's an entity, it's a fixed entity, or do you believe that with effort and with experience you can develop them? You're always going to have some form of a continuum of answers, right? Some people are going to be more on the I can develop, and some people will be more on the fixed entity. What the evidence suggests very clearly is that people who believe that they can grow, so people who show more of a growth mindset, actually do develop, actually do better in school, actually have more willpower, and so on. So this line of work is being extended to new characteristics, but it seems to be very robust. The condition number one of being able to improve is to believe that indeed you can. And by the way, for those of you who have kids, a very interesting idea, the power of yet. A school did something quite interesting. Instead of telling kids, not there, not acquired, bad, not good, they said, not yet. And the notion, of course, of not yet is an indication that, well, you're not there, but it also says, with work, you might be able to get there. So that's one aspect. Now, the other aspect of good news is that increasingly we can put people in various kinds of machines to see what happens in their brains. And so one of the things that we've realized is that contrary to what many of us were taught when we were kids, I assume that for many of you, you were taught early on, human beings are born with a certain number of neurons. Every day you lose a few, and then one day you die. Not when you're at zero, but just, it just goes down. What we now know is that actually human beings produce new neurons throughout their lives, and if they work at it, they can create new neural connections. One of the ways we see this is that the blue people lose less density in their neural connections. Their brain looks more dense. And the blue people are the ones who meditate. The red people are the ones who do not meditate. So I will let you decide whether you're a red or a blue. But the point is, we can see, and we have now been able to establish very clearly, that a regular meditation practice changes the texture of your brain, which is, I think, something that most of us did not anticipate a few years ago. Again, same thing, we call this brain plasticity. You look at taxi drivers in London, they have to go through a very complex process. It's called the knowledge. It takes a year or two. And as you know, taxi drivers in London are one of the few cities in the world where they actually know just about every part of the city. Well, we have looked at their hippocampus before and after the training, and guess what? Their hippocampus, which is a part of the brain associated with memory, and particularly visual spatial memory, is observably thicker. So again, what we've now realized is the brain's texture evolves over the years, in part in response to our own activities. So the good news is it is possible. The bad news is it's not easy. And all those of you who have come on executive programs and who have said, oh, wow, this was life transforming, know this. Also, all those of you who make New Year resolution, this year, you know, darn it, I will do this, know that it's not easy. Let's examine why it's not easy, or one of the reasons. So let's go back to when we were children. We were trying to learn how to bicycle. Most of us had training wheels, you know, the little wheels on the side, and they help you stay stable. The problem is you go reasonably slowly. So at that point, you are unconscious of your incompetence. You are incompetent, you need the training wheels, but you're unconscious of it. And then one day you see older kids whiz by and you say to your parents, I want to go faster. And they say, well, then we have to take off the training wheels. We take off the training wheels, and now you become quite conscious of your incompetence because now you fall. So what's going to happen now is that you're going to work really hard, you're going to fall quite a bit, there's going to be a lot of crying. Some of you may have done that with your own kids. And at some point, you're going to become consciously competent, meaning that with effort, this is going to work. And if you continue to practice, you're going to become unconsciously competent, meaning that you don't have to think about the bicycling process too much, right? As soon as you get on the bicycle, boom, you can go off, which I assume is where most of you are. So it starts here with an unconscious, a lack of consciousness of our incompetence. Then we become conscious that we're not very good at this. Then hopefully we become a little bit better with effort. And over time, if we keep practicing, we're going to become skilled, meaning we don't have to think about this a heck of a lot. Now, buzz group number 2. As we go through this process, what are some of the challenges that we face? So again, let's assume I want to become more encouraging of diversity, or I want to become more assertive. This is an issue we have a lot in Asia. People who say, look, I value relationships, and I don't express my point of view enough. So I want to become more assertive, more, less of a nice person. I mean, no, I still want to be a nice person, I just want to be more assertive. For some of us in the room, maybe it's the other way around. You haven't found a fight that you would walk away from, and so maybe you want to become more patient. What are some of the challenges that you face in this process? 2 minutes. This is noisy again. Can you turn on the light? Can you turn on the lights? Thirty seconds. Especially after lunch.
Yes.
Huh?
You hit them up. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So you see, as the afternoon progresses, we're now getting this really in sync. Now we're in sync between the pedagogy and the lights. Well, now the lights are on me, they're not on you. So now it means I'm talking, you stop talking. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. It was a joke. So what are some of the thoughts that came up? What are some of the challenges? And as Narayan said this morning, it is so easy to talk about the difficulties that others are experiencing in this process. Maybe let's make this a little bit more real. I assume that all of you have been trying, at least at some point in your life, to develop a capability in some area. So what are the challenges that you faced? Speak loudly, because it will be easier for me to capture. I can actually write on this thing. So what challenges have you faced? Speak loud. Yes?
You can't fall off the bicycle too often in real life.
Meaning that if I fail too often, the world will penalize me. So the cost of failure. The cost of failure. Very true. Yes?
Feeling like an idiot.
Okay, so the feeling of vulnerability. Let's call it vulnerability. It sounds more sophisticated. But you're right. Basically, as a child, we would fall all the time. But, you know, we would just get back up. Now we fall and we go, has anybody noticed? So there's a sense of, you know, am I the only schmuck who can do this? What else? Yes?
The self-awareness, whether you actually fail or not.
So maybe I don't even realize I'm not failing. I'm failing, absolutely. So lack of awareness. Absolutely. Lack of awareness of limitations. What else? Yes?
Pace. As in, am I going too fast? Am I going too slow?
Okay, so doubt on the pace. One last one?
Lack of feedback from others about how you're performing.
Oops, sorry. Lack of feedback, which I guess is potentially connected to the lack of awareness. It's just, and I'll make that comment later on, but I can make it immediately. And this one gets worse the more senior you become. Since Cillian became dean, he has become funnier than before. I mean, he was always funny. He was always smart and humorous. Now that he's dean, everything takes a little bit more, you know. So of course, yes. But you already have approved my salary for this year, and you will have forgotten. So the point is that the more senior you become, the less good feedback you get. And we could even say this is particularly true in Asia. It is true in a lot of countries with power distance, but in most Asian countries, it is particularly challenging. So indeed, for all of these reasons, and a few more. So let me build on some of the things that you've mentioned. We've identified 4. How did we identify this? Well, in spite of my youthful appearance, I've been involved in efforts like this for something like 25 years. For the first few years, you realize that, you know, people have learned stuff in the program, but they don't really change a heck of a lot in terms of their behavior. And initially, you don't notice that because you're too busy getting the program right. Then you realize it, but you're not the program director, so you say, one day I will be directing the program, it will work better. And then one day you direct the program, and you say, but the program is not yet exactly as good as I would like it to be. And then one day the program is as good as you would like it to be, and it takes you 2-3 years to realize that it's not really working. So when I rejoined INSEAD in 2011, that's one of the first conversations I had. I said, I would like to develop a program that is going to give us a greater chance of making a real difference for senior executives. And so we designed a program that has a number of characteristics. It's modular, there's a lot of practice and so on. Anyway, I'll probably touch on this. The point is, we designed the program specifically to help senior leaders to develop new capabilities. And as the program unfolded, we started having people saying, wow, this is hard. Ooh, this is hard. And those are self-selected people who want to be here, right? And even they find it hard. And so I had to sit down and ask myself, why do they find it so hard? And I've identified, or I've crystallized 4 major challenges. The number one you've already mentioned, the lack of awareness. Basically, most senior executives think that they're already pretty damn good. Yes, what got me here may not get me there, but you know, it got me here, huh? And that's already something. And in fact, most of the time, I'm pretty good. So the first problem is we often underestimate the extent to which we need help. To put it otherwise, we overestimate the extent to which we're already doing it. And so in our head, we go like, delegation, yes, sure, paf. Diversity, of course, paf. So the box is ticked unless strong disconfirming feedback, which again, as we said earlier, is often not forthcoming. Now let's assume you beat obstacle number 1 and you say, yeah, actually, I probably need to work on this. Obstacle number 2 is most senior executives don't work hard enough at developing the capabilities anymore. The first one is they don't invest enough effort in acquiring the new knowledge. Now, here in this room, of course, it's difficult for you to make notes, right? Because the seating is, so you're taking pictures, which is really, really good. Not entirely clear what you'll do with those pictures, but it's good. And you should take pictures, it's good. And I noticed that my dean is making notes. But not for the joke before, huh? So everything is here, good. So again, senior executives hardly make notes anymore. Now they're so smart, you know. And they go like, besides, I'll remember. Look, let's be honest, you won't. Huh? You won't. So we know very well the way this works is we learn something and then, boom, very rapidly we lose most of it. Look, how many times have you found notes that you wrote? Forget notes written by somebody else, but wrote notes that you wrote like 2 weeks ago and you go, oh, wow, that was actually clever. Huh? So you're going to need to reread your notes, and then you'll lose it, but you'll lose less and slower. You're going to reread, and then you'll lose less and slower, and then at some point it becomes more internalized. We don't do this anymore. When you were at school, you did this. At university, you did this. Now we don't do this much. Huh? By the way, remember also, it's very nice if it's in your cell phone, but if it's not in your head, you're not using it. Oh. No, I'm serious. This is very important. Again, now we go like, oh yeah, I got it. No, you got it in your cell phone. And you will not interrupt the next meeting to say, ooh, let me check what Manzoni said at the forum. This will not happen. So the idea of capturing the notes is not because it's in the notes. It's so that you can reread the notes so that at some point it's in your head. The second problem is we tend to underestimate how difficult it is to implement management knowledge. You know, some of the stuff we talk about, like fair process, how complex can it be? You know, the point, for example, is at Nissan, about 25,000 people lost their job. This was very unfair as an outcome. These people had done nothing to deserve losing their job. But because the process was fair, they were more likely to accept the negative outcome. So some of us have been doing research in this area for 25 years. And then we say to people, fair process, what would make the process fair? Well, let me see, you would engage people, you would listen to them, you would be reasonably transparent. Yeah, that kind of makes sense, right? And then you go home. And now suddenly you've got to announce to 500 people that they're losing their jobs, or that we're moving head office from this part of town to that one, or that we're closing this part of the company, or that we're buying another company elsewhere. And suddenly you say, oh yeah, fair process. Yeah, so engage. Who? For how long? Do I just show up? I get all of them in a room? And so Jean-François on the phone will say, yeah, it's a good idea. But Jean-François, they're very angry. Yeah, but trust the process. You know, if you treat them in an adult sort of way, you'll see they'll converge. And they say, it's easy for you to say, you're halfway around the world, you're not facing them, they don't look happy. So what happens is, most people, when they leave the school, will not identify this actionability gap. And so when they arrive, they will go like, ooh, we didn't discuss all the granular details of how to implement this. And so either you'll have a fear of failure and you'll just do it the same way as usual, or you'll try it a new way and you'll fail. Okay, so problem number 1, lack of awareness. Problem number 2, underinvestment in acquiring the new knowledge. Problem number 3, so now we're working, we're trying, and it's painful. For the reasons we said before, nobody likes to look like an idiot or feel like an idiot. If I fall too often from the bicycle, somebody's going to say, hey, if you can't do this, I'll find somebody who can. So the hope is that we're going to become consciously competent, but because this is painful, there is a little bit of a temptation to declare victory and basically move back into unconscious incompetence. And we say, well, you know, this works in theory, but in practice, you know, of course in academia. Or we say, yeah, I still snap at people, but now I'm much more aware of it. So basically it becomes, the third problem is a lack of persistence, and it's a lack of persistence because, frankly, I'd rather go back to unconscious incompetence. It was easier that way. Now, why do we have implementation difficulties? 3 reasons. First reason. I gave the example of the kid learning to bicycle. Your job is actually much harder than the kid learning to bicycle. Because the child learning to bicycle doesn't have 50 years of bad habits, or 40 years of bad habits, or 35, or 60, or 70. So the problem is we already have neural connections that have been nurtured very carefully for decades. And so let's assume, for example, that I tend to be the more conflict-avoidant type. I find myself in a situation where I can sense that our discussion could become a little bit conflictual. My brain is going to say, Jean-François, evade. So the first thing I got to do is I've got to intercept that response. The second thing I've got to do is I've got to say, no, now under new management, I'm going to be more assertive. The second thing I've got to do is I've got to interrogate my brain and say, what would an assertive response sound like? And so my brain will scan through possible responses. I hate you. No, that may not be very effective. I disagree with you profoundly, and in fact, I've been meaning to tell you this for 5 years. No, that's probably not good either. So you're going to look for an appropriate response, and then you'll have to say it. By the way, you've got about 3 to 5 seconds to do this. Because after 5 seconds, the person in front of you will look and will go, hello? So this is really challenging. This is really challenging. You've got to intercept the habitual response, figure out the better response, produce the better response, all of this under stress and under time pressure. So all of these things require self-control. You understand why? Willpower. Now, there is something about self-control. Don't try to read this. There is something about self-control which works like this. This is a study of Israeli judges, parole judges. So these are criminals, and they have been in jail for a number of years, and they are hoping to get out early. You understand? You were sentenced to 25 years, you've done 15, and at the end of the 15, you say, now I'm much better, I will be fine, you can trust me, please release me back into society. There is a joke in the legal environment that it all depends on what the judge had for breakfast. Empirically, this actually proves to be wrong. It doesn't have anything to do with what the judge had for breakfast. It has everything to do with at what time of day you're showing up. So if you show up at 8:30 in the morning, you've got a 70% chance of getting released. If you show up just before the break, hey, it's too bad, you're staying in. If you show up immediately at 10 o'clock after the break, you got a 70% chance of getting out. Just before lunch, 10%. After lunch, there's one guy who comes out, everybody else stays in. This is a true study. This is reality, is among experienced Israeli judges. Why? They get exhausted. It's exhausting to make these decisions. So the first one, I agonize over. The second one, I agonize over. And by now, I get what we call ego depleted. And when we're ego depleted, we revert back to the default solution. In the case of a parole judge, the default solution is you stay in. In the case of our trying to change, the default solution is I'm going to do it the same way I've always done it. So problem number 1 is willpower. Problem number 2, as I said, you're going to interrogate your brain. Look, I don't know what it means to be assertive. If I knew, I would be. So it's hard to find the right answer, and then it's hard to produce that answer. So we're going to have implementation difficulties for these reasons. Basically, it's very hard when there are habitual behaviors. The second reason is that in life, we very often face situations like this. So we would like to do something. You see, I want to delegate, absolutely. I also want the output of my department to be very strong because, again, I can't fall off the bicycle. I want to be outward looking, but I also have to take care of all of these things. I want to be more assertive, and I also want to maintain very nice relationships with people. So this is called a competing commitment, where you are committed to doing X, but you're also committed to doing Y, and X and Y are not perfectly compatible. So here is an example which was quite enlightening for me. It has been argued by some members of my ecosystem that I have a slight tendency to be late. I am very skeptical, but let's assume for a second that occasionally I can be late. And so I found this 4 habits of punctual people. I thought, wow, let me read this. They're realistic thinkers. Yeah, okay, I can do this. They give themselves buffer time. So I think it's going to take me 20 minutes. I'll add 10 minutes just in case. That I never do. Because, you know, if I think it's going to take 20 minutes, I'm going to say 18. Then they're organized. No comment. And then they're comfortable with downtime. So, you know, you said you thought it was 20, you said 30, you're going to have 10 minutes downtime. It's okay, you know, you're going to chill, I don't chill. I just go from one thing to another. So when I saw this, I thought, you know, that's why, arguably and allegedly, on occasion, I can be late. Because I want to be on time, I really do. It's just that I also want to use every minute very intensely. So that's a competing commitment. You want X, you want Y. X and Y are hard to do. Reason number 3 why we have so many difficulties is that, you know, some of us are carrying stuff from the past. And on a daily basis, we've learned to live with it. So this is somebody that I met in a program. Very interesting guy, charming, nice, really very seductive, can get people to do things, and getting feedback from his environment that he is tough, brutal, almost mean. And he says, Jean-François, I don't get it. You know, I mean, you've experienced me. I'm a nice guy. I'm charming. And I said, yes, you are. And then, you know, you're within 1 module, 2 modules, 3 modules, and you realize that whenever we're discussing human issues, he does have a bit of a tendency to completely miss the emotional side of things. Completely. It just doesn't register. And it took us a while to realize this is a non-Caucasian. In other words, this is somebody with a brown skin who, age 7, was sent by his parents from Nigeria, where he's not from, but he was in Nigeria, to the UK in a boarding school. Now, boarding schools in the UK are not necessarily easy for anyone, but for a brown kid 45 years ago, apparently it was quite tough. So over 15 years, what this guy has learned is he's learned to disconnect emotionally. And it doesn't show. Again, on a daily basis, he's a charming man, married, kids, a philanthropist, a wonderful guy, I assure you. But when the rubber meets the road, he is emotionally disconnected. And it took us a while to understand why. Similarly, I had another executive who was consistently anxious. Well, look, it took a while for this person's subordinate to understand that it happened to be a she, that A, she was coming from a Jewish family, B, she was coming from a Jewish family who'd lost people in the war, C, her father died young. And if you want to understand how she functions, you have to understand that she is pathologically anxious. And by the way, she's got to understand why. So these things are coming up in some of the programs that we run. And again, some of you would say, hey, if I want to talk about this, I'll go talk to a psychoanalyst. And our answer is, that's okay, except you see, if you're this guy, I can give you all the tricks in the world to be nicer. But if you're emotionally disconnected because of something that happened 40 years ago, you're going to remain emotionally connected. And with my tricks, you will simply be more skilled emotionally disconnected. But people will notice. But for these 3 reasons, it's going to be hard, and then people want to go back. And let's assume you make it through. Darn it, your ecosystem will not give you positive feedback. You expect people to say, Sean, Very courageous of you this morning to ask a question that was going against the point that your wife was making. This is very, very courageous of you. Huh? You would expect people to do that, but no, they're not going to do this. Why are they not going to congratulate you on your efforts? They're not going to congratulate you, A, because you don't do it well all the time. Also, they may not even notice that you're trying to do it well because they've decided that you don't do it well. In some cases, they kind of liked the old you. You know, when we say, oh, you should be more assertive, yeah, you should be more assertive, especially with other folks. With me, continue to be quite agreeable. People say, boss, you should delegate more. Except, you know, right now you don't delegate. I have two benefits. One, I don't have to do the work. Two, I can complain about you. Now you're starting to delegate. A, I can't complain about you anymore. B, I've got to do the work. The point is, whenever we want to change something, the ecosystem needs to accept and ultimately to support. Voilà, so we find these four challenges. The first one, insufficient awareness, had been mentioned. The second one, insufficient effort, investment in knowing. The third one, we're going to face implementation difficulties for the three reasons I mentioned. And so the temptation is going to be to say, I'm okay now. And the fourth one is insufficient support from the ecosystem. Problem is, these get worse as you get more senior. We already said this, less honest feedback at the top, more superficial knowledge also. You've gone to these forums, you heard some of the words, and so, you know, you got, yeah, sure, fair process, I got that. Less time to study, let's be frank. Also, less ability to self-control. Your life is already requiring an enormous amount of self-control. Less tolerance for conscious incompetence for the reasons we discussed. So cost of reduced credibility. I can't fall off my bike too often. Dislike for vulnerability. And also at some point you start saying, hey, look, I'm not that bad, you know. What do they know? I didn't see that. Brand more firmly established. And so because your brand is more firmly established, they will not notice that you're making an effort. And again, it's going to be harder for senior executives to say, I need help. Okay, so given all these reasons, last buzz group, how can you beat these four obstacles? What are some of the thoughts that come to your mind? What are some of the things that you can do to give yourself a better chance of developing new capabilities over time and becoming better at developing these new capabilities over time? So I'll give you 2.5 minutes in your buzz groups, and I'll remind you of what the four obstacles are here. So 2.5 minutes, we give them the light, and it becomes noisy. 1 minute. Okay, so let's gently get back into plenary mode. So we have 4 challenges: insufficient awareness, insufficient effort, investment, insufficient persistence due to significant reasons, and insufficient support from ecosystem. So what are some of your thoughts? What came up? How do we beat these obstacles? What can you do to increase your odds of success? Yes?
We could just to put Bara, just leave the echo chamber, trying to get new external references.
So get more external feedback.
Yeah, but leave out of your regular environment.
Okay, so get more external feedback, and the point is particularly from outside of your normal environment. Except if it's outside of your normal environment, how do they know you? Maybe they know you, but they, okay, maybe they know you, but not necessarily professionally, okay? What else? Yes?
Give yourself more time, maybe instead of focusing on 100 things, focus only on 1 or 2, so prioritize.
So focus on 1 or 2 key things. Keyword, prioritize or focus. Okay, you cannot do 74 different things. What else? Yes?
Make change part of your brand.
Tell me more.
Set the expectation up in people's minds that you are that person who's willing to
Okay.
constantly experiment.
Okay, so basically, so I'm going to say make change, make continuous development part of your brand. I like this. This is very nicely put. Part of your brand. And basically, be explicit. Tell people, look, I'm working on this. And you know, if you see me doing this, maybe give me a hand. And by the way, I'm not perfect. And by the way, I don't expect you to be. So this is a collective, we're all work in progress. Make this part of your brand, okay? Yes? Okay. Find an environment where you can experiment and fail. Find an experiment where failure is less costly. So when I do the bicycle in that environment, it's okay. It's going to be less costly. Very good point. One more?
For me, you've got to reprogram your neural pathways.
Yes?
The default mode becomes the new mode you want.
And so how do you do that, or how can you help yourself? So there's the practice. And in fact, what the evidence is, and I'll mention this in a second, it's also reflective practice. It's not just practice, because otherwise you can practice poorly for ages. One last one, I saw your hand up. Keep on learning. So again, it's this notion of brand, and enjoy the ride, maybe. Keep on learning and enjoy the ride. Okay. So those are very good. Let me share a few that we've, again, identified and we're trying to implement, particularly, of course, in the LEAP program, because it was designed that way, but also in other programs, and Narayan, I think, will come back on this later. So 4 key enablers. let me just go through the first one. The first one, you've already identified it. It's got something to do with this notion of focus. This is going to require work. If you want to move the course of a river, you don't put just a finger in it. And if the river doesn't move, you say, gee, I mean, I made an effort, I put a finger in it. You come with equipment. So same here. The first thing, stop lying to yourself and get some feedback. Again, we work hard at this, at creating better awareness. We work hard at this with external feedback, with feedback from people with whom they work in the groups. So we have to create experiential activities where people behave. And this way they cannot say, I have no idea what they said in the 360 feedback. I don't do that. And we say, well, actually, you've been doing it for 3 weeks. So first, let's get some reality check. 2, select one thing, maybe 2, but ideally 1, and select a very important one. Not something that somebody else is a nice to have. Select something which is going to be essential for you. Maybe something which is connected to your big goal in life. If some of you are thinking, big goal in life? I don't have a big goal in life. Well, maybe you might want to consider having one because it will guide your activities. Phrase the goal positively. Research shows that if you say to yourself, okay, I'm in a meeting, don't interrupt. Don't interrupt. Don't interrupt. What does your mind focus on? Interrupting. So the brain does not really register negative injunctions. So if you say, don't do this, don't smoke, the only thing you want to do is to smoke. So, no, this is true. So phrase the goal positively. Instead of saying, don't interrupt, you could say to yourself, listen, pay attention, learn, be curious. Again, there are a number of things that you can say. And by the way, try to break it down into smaller steps. If you say, Manzoni's right, I'm going to become more assertive. Well, look, this is going to take 20 years, right? So we might try to find one way or one smaller intermediary goal that we can celebrate. And then the third one is give yourself a chance. That means study, read, memorize, reread your notes. We read too much and we don't reread enough. Increase your bandwidth, plan breaks. People like you go from one meeting to another, to another, to another. By the 4th meeting, you are totally ego depleted, and it is not individual 2.0 who shows up. It's definitely the version 1.0. Get a coach, get a buddy, get an accountability support, and invest time and effort to get the right kind of support. Again, too often our executives live our programs, they go back home, and they haven't thought about what do I need to tell people? What help do I need from them? You see, you want to be more patient for some of you. But maybe what happens is there are people around you who have learned to push your buttons. And if you want to become more patient, they're going to have to stop pushing these buttons. Or at least they're going to have to push them less often. So regardless of what you're trying to do, you're going to need help from your ecosystem. The second thing that we're going to need you to do is we're going to need you to focus more and to be here and now more often. It's quite remarkable. Most of the people who walk into Leap think that they are reasonably present. And then once they start realizing what being present means, they realize that most of the time they're not present. They're not paying attention to what happens around them. There's a wonderful study by Dan Gilbert at Harvard who showed that basically on average people are thinking of something else than what they're trying to do about 47% of the time. About 50% of the time, people's mind wanders. There are 1 or 2 activities where their mind wanders less. I will let you identify what those might be. This is what they found. But aside from that, the mind wanders. By the way, the more your mind wanders, the lower the happiness score that people reported. So the human mind is a wandering mind, but a wandering mind is also an unhappy mind. So one of the things that we really help people do is we help them to become more mindful. Now, 4 years ago when we started Leap, I did not use the word mindfulness because I was concerned that people thought, oh my God, that's it, I came to INSEAD and now it's California, and so I called it presence. And what has happened is over the last few years, the word, thank God, it's very good, the word has become mainstream. 2 years ago at the World Economic Forum, one of the superstars was Mathieu Ricard. Mathieu Ricard is a French Buddhist monk who is the French interpreter of the Dalai Lama. And let me tell you, in the Davos corridors, Buddhist monks make an impression. So it is very much on the agenda, including, as I said, of the World Economic Forum, of helping people to become more mindful. Because if you're not here and now, the habit wins. Because the habit requires zero attention from you. If you want to be able to intercept the habitual response and create a better response, if you want version 2.0 to show up, you've got to be here and now. If your mind is wandering, version 1.0 is showing up. So we help our participants to become better at this. In particular, we start them with easy exercises of conscious breathing because that's the easiest way to bring yourself back. Try to do 2 minutes where you're just focused on the air coming in and the air coming out. Most of you will not reach 2 minutes. After about 45 seconds, you'll be breathe in. Oh, I got to talk to Joe. Breathe out. Oof, I forgot this. So you'll bring your mind back. You'll go now 2 minutes. And you will find it challenging at front to do 2 minutes. Of course, ultimately, we also expose them to meditative practices. Of course, they are very secular sort of activities. But again, there are long-standing traditions, particularly in the East, of course, on this. We also help them to develop breaks in their schedule. Technology is part of the problem, but technology is also part of the solution. There are mindfulness apps. And some of my participants are really getting extremely good mileage out of this. And we will give you these slides. I'm told they will go in some platform. So again, technology can be part of the solution. So 1, you're going to have to give yourself a chance to put enough effort. 2, develop the mindfulness. 3, we help people to become more reflective. More reflective means more sophisticated about their understanding of things. There's an old, increasingly old Dutch football player called Johan Cruyff, who had a very interesting sentence. He said, when you understand it, you will see it. When you understand it, you will see it. And of course, most of us are like, no, it's the other way around. It's when you see it, you'll understand it. No. Because if you don't understand it, it will not print on your radar screen. So you need to have the words, you need to have enough reflectiveness to be able to look back at things in a more sophisticated way. So you mentioned this earlier, deliberate practice. And as you mentioned, try to find an area where practice is less costly. Absolutely. That doesn't necessarily mean at home. Failure at home can be costly. So maybe, again, it's when you travel or, no, I'm serious. Failure at home can be costly. So maybe it's when you travel or it's in some of your other activities. Observe, be curious, so much to learn. One of the things we do is we show movies or clips of movies. You know, now when I watch a movie, there's a part of me that watches the movie because it's supposed to be fun, but also I'm looking at it from a leadership point of view. What is illustrated? What is interesting in terms of the behavior of the leader or of the led? So curiosity. 3, think ahead. Anticipate what the conversation might be like. Anticipate what other people might say. Now, some of you might say, but Jean-François, 2 minutes ago you said be present. Yes, I did. Be present doesn't mean don't think about the future. It means when you're thinking about the future, think constructively of the future. And be actively focused on what might come up. What would I say if this came up? You notice I said, what would I say if this came up? I didn't say, what will I say when they say that? Because that's dysfunctional, right? That's you trying to anticipate a conversation, and then you will be too tight in your conduct of the conversation. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to prepare your neural connections so that when you have the 3 seconds, it can find what to say. Because if it's not prepared, you will not find in 3 seconds. And finally, you can think back on things. There's a wonderful study that was conducted recently at Wipro by Francesca Gino and some of her colleagues. It's interesting because they could measure effectiveness of individuals. So they hired a bunch of people, and for half of them, they basically worked throughout the day, and at the end of the day, they were given 15 minutes to do whatever. The other half were given 15 minutes to reflect on the day. those who reflected for 15 minutes on their day had performance after a month that was 23% higher than the control group. So in a month, you already have 25% effectiveness that is superior because they've reflected on what they were doing. Reflection speeds up your learning curve. Now, some of you might say, Jean-François, be serious. Who does this? Well, the answer is Gandhi and Warren Buffett. You know, I rest my case sort of thing. So Mahatma Gandhi basically throughout his life took some time at the end of his day to look back on the day and reflect, gee, I did this, maybe I should have done that. Why did I do this? So all throughout his life, including until the end. Warren Buffett says, I insist on a lot of time being spent almost every day just to sit and think. You know, that's probably uncommon. I read, I sit, and I think. And I do it because I kind of like it. And that has done reasonably well for him. By the way, just so we're clear, this man was called one of the best learning machines on this earth. I love that term. I mean, it's not very poetic, I give you that, but learning machine. Just so we're clear. So again, this man right now is about 85. Last year, he had an annual general meeting, right, where he brings in the shareholders. And you understand, the shareholders come, and then it's an adoration session, right? Warren comes in, and it's like, wow! And what he did is he brought in the room a short seller. So somebody who is short on Berkshire Hathaway. And people, of course, booed the guy. And Warren Buffett said, no, we don't do that. We invited him because we want to listen to what he says. Then we can decide what we want to agree or disagree with, but we want to listen to what he says. So this is one of the world's most successful investors, 84 years old, showing up at a meeting where people are going to adore him, who says, let's do away with the adoration. Let's try to listen to somebody who disagrees with us. That's learning. And the last aspect is ideally you would develop some resilience, because this is not going to be simple. You know, in my family, we tend to have, arguably and allegedly, a slightly shorter fuse than most, allegedly. It's a thing that we've been transmitting from father to son. That's the way it is. And some of us in my family, especially my brothers, me, I'm very Buddha nature, but my brothers have been working on this for decades. You know, and so once in a while, they blow a gasket. And then they say, oh, you know, it's terrible. Yes, but there's also many times where you succeeded. So one of the things we help our executives do is to notice and celebrate success. A lot to be learned from failure, of course. And when we have breakdowns, we ask ourselves, what do I learn from this? How do I get back on track? But we also want to notice and appreciate success. There's a very key sentence here which says, neurons that fire together, wire together. And so when you did something good, make sure that you notice it and nurture this, because it's making the neural connection stronger. And the last thing is, exactly as you said earlier, learn to live more comfortably with conscious incompetence. Maybe acknowledge it, make it part of your brand, to say, look, we're a work in progress. You know, I never claimed I'm perfect, but I work really hard at it. And that's also what I would like to see from you. You would be in good company, of course. This is Thomas Edison, the guy who discovered quite a few things, but in the process had a number of failure. And he used to say, no, I haven't really failed. You know, I've just found another way that doesn't work. And I'm not discouraged, because every time I find another way that doesn't work, I'm getting closer to the truth. This is Confucius, I'm told. So I typed Confucius, and this is the face that came up. Our greatest glory is not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. And of course, in the Indian tradition, Krishnamurti, there is no end to education. So these individuals basically have been saying, look, you want to learn, you've got to accept that you're going to fail, but then you've got to stay on track. You've got to reflect on why you failed. What is it saying about you, about others? What is it saying about the triggers? And then you've got to get back on your attempt to developing new capabilities. So some of us are working on this issue. Again, you'll get some of these references. And because the screen turned red and it says time's up, this is the moment where I'm supposed to stop and say best wishes to you.